Here's a little glimpse into my Saturday mornings. I wake up roughly at about 5:30 every morning. My dog's bladder can't stand me staying asleep much longer. And Becca likes to sleep, so I get up and I go down and I let the dogs out, make the coffee, let the dogs in, feed the dogs, sit down in my chair with my coffee and goof off on my phone for however long it is until one of my daughters wakes up. And as soon as one of my daughters wakes up, the first thing they always want is my phone. Apparently the big TV is too much for them in the morning. They have to have something that they can control and they can make annoy me or whatever. They have to have the little phone as opposed to the big TV. But whatever. I give them that way there's no crying and the rest of the house can sleep. So I give them my phone and I turn on the Lord of the Rings. I enjoy the Lord of the Rings because while it is very heavy with violence, I don't have to worry about the language and I don't have to worry about sex. So I can watch it and all is well. So I am on a perpetual rotation of the Lord of the Rings on my Saturday loop. I am currently just finishing up the Return of the Kings, only to next Saturday follow it up with the Hobbit. Now I got all 6 to go through, so plenty of things to occupy my Saturday. So when I encounter the gospel lesson today, the Lord of the Rings is on my mind because I'm always watching this, and it will become apparent shortly. In our gospel lesson today, we've jumped a bit from last week. In fact, we've jumped an entire chapter. So immediately on the heels of last week, we have the feeding of the 4,000. But since we've already trod that ground, we spent a month and a half on the feeding of the 5,000 and the aftermath, we decide to skip it. But I think it's interesting to note that the shortest gospel account, Mark, the one with the least amount of space, still includes this feeding of the 4,000. Yet we skip it. But whatever, I digress. Then after this, Jesus gets upset of the obtuseness of the Pharisees as they demand a sign. They demand a sign right after the feeding of the 4,000, where he multiplies loaves and fish yet again. But they want a sign. Then Jesus' disciples go out on the boat with him and they forget the bread and they think that Jesus is mad about him forgetting the bread. Obviously, he wants to do another feeding miracle. But there's lots of bread. We've done that for a month and a half, so we skip it. But for some reason, we also skip a healing of a blind man. We have seen it before. Obviously, he does many healings, but not really like this one. This one is interesting. This healing takes place in 2 stages. In stage 1, Jesus anoints the man's eyes with saliva. I think that's a much better way of putting it than my Bible just says he spits on his eyes. It's much nicer to think of him, doing it this way. Much nicer. Jesus then lays his hands on the man's head and asks him, "Do you see anything?" The man says, "I see men, but they look like trees walking." So stage 2. Jesus lays his hands on the man's head again, on his eyes, and he opens the blind man's eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. This is what Matthew says. This is just a really weird healing. Did Jesus not do it properly on the first time, so he felt he needed to go back and do a bit more? Gauging the situation. Say, well, can you see now? No? Okay, well, what if I tune this up here? There you go. Now you can see. But why the 2 stages? Jesus, we've seen him do it many times where he heals and it's super abundant. It's more than they could ask for. But this one is done in 2 stages because it prepares us for what happens in the gospel lesson today. Jesus asks, "Who do people say that I am?" And they give him a spattering of answers. Then he turns to his disciples and says, "But who do you say that I am?" Jesus has done the most work with them, so they should get the answer right. And they do. Peter steps up, speaking on behalf of all the disciples, and he says, "You are the Christ." Then Jesus explains what it means to be the Christ, using Isaiah's understanding of the suffering servant. Peter then begins to rebuke Jesus. He says, "No, Lord, you are the Christ, God's anointed, his soldier who's going to come in to establish the kingdom on earth by reestablishing Jewish rule in Jerusalem, and maybe even the Promised Land, but definitely in Jerusalem." And Jesus rebukes Peter. He doesn't see the picture clearly enough. His eyes have not yet been opened fully. He sees the men, but they're like trees walking. This is why we are given 2 stages of healing of this blind man. Because now that Jesus has opened the blind eyes of his disciples, allowing them to see that he is indeed the Christ, Jesus is going to fully open their eyes by showing them what this means. But today, Mark steps back from us and allows us to ask the same question. He allows Jesus to ask us the same question that Jesus asked Peter. "But who do you say that I am?" And our answers will come back with in various degrees of 2 stages of the healing of this blind man. Hopefully the answers aren't the previous answers to Peter's, all these things that Jesus is not, but those are on the spectrum as well of answers that could be. But how can we tell where on the spectrum we fall from trees walking to full sight? Because obviously, if we're here, we think we have the full sight. But how do we tell? How do we know where on the spectrum we fall? Well, James lets us know. Action. See, in the 2 Towers, back to the Lord of the Rings, this is book 2 of the Lord of the Rings, we are introduced to the Ents. And the Ents are actual trees that walk. In the book, they gather and they talk extremely slowly, and they talk about whether or not they will join the battle against evil. And after their discussion, they elect to do nothing. It's not until Merry and Pippin tell Treebeard to take them closer to the fighting that the Ents find out that this war actually does affect them as well. Once they see that Saruman is clear-cutting their home and killing the trees that they care for, they sound the call to action and enter into the war. This is how James tells us we have our eyes fully open. When we see with the eyes of Christ and see those whom he loved and seek to do what he did, then we know where we are, because we have gone from the nebulous head knowledge of love your neighbor with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and your neighbor as yourself, to actually seeing your neighbor in need and loving God with all your heart, mind, and strength by helping them and loving them as God would. Very practical man, that James. He gives us a very definitive answer to where we fall. He says, if you want to know where you are on the spectrum of trees walking to man seeing, he says, it's your willingness to put your money where your mouth is. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.